Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. I'm John Streeter and today is Wednesday, the 29th of April. We are still under the coronavirus lockdown and today we're going to take a look at part 2 of my response to Brian Hales when he responded to my invitation to have somebody point out a vicious lie in the Nauvoo Expositor. He wrote a comment on my blog saying that one of the vicious lies was the idea that a woman, if she refused Joseph Smith's proposal for plural marriage, then he would damn her, or God would damn her, or some sort of disparagement would happen. Hales makes the case that women were free to reject Joseph Smith and there were no untoward consequences. Now, yesterday we took a look at the exact verbiage in the Nauvoo Expositor, and I was able to make what I feel is a pretty strong case that the verbiage articulated in the Nauvoo Expositor reflected the revelation on polygamy, which was part of what Joseph Smith would have had to convey or teach to any women who were potentially going to receive his proposal. And as we can see in the Revelation in Doctrine and Covenants section 132, it includes the notion that if you reject that law, then you are subject to damnation. So that being said, though, we do want to look at the exact claims that Brian Hales made in his response and just look at the weight. How powerful are those examples in making the case that Brian wants to make? And that's where today we are going to look at the women who said nope. The women that Brian Hales says and cites as examples of people who refused Joseph Smith and there was no consequence. So let's go to the article now and we will simply just start from there. Okay. Defending the Expositor, Joseph and the Women Who Said Nope. A response to Brian Hales, Part 2. In part 1 of this response, we examined a submission by LDS researcher and author Brian Hales in response to a challenge for someone to find a vicious lie contained in the Nauvoo Expositor. See the full post for details. Now, while in part 1 we addressed the actual statement in the Expositor, Hales' main argument is not about what the Expositor actually said, but an extrapolation from it. In his submission, he states, now this is quoting Brian Hales, "There are many problems with claims made in the Nauvoo Expositor, but since you only asked for one, consider this statement. She is thunderstruck, faints, recovers, and refuses. The prophet damns her if she rejects." That's Brian Hales quoting from the Nauvoo Expositor. Joseph Smith's offer of plural marriages were apparently turned down by several women. The historical record indicates that his preferred response to these rebuffs was to quietly let the matter rest. No evidence of retaliatory excommunications or other vengeful reactions have been found, although twice he sought to counteract allegations he considered untrue. That's Brian Hales in his comment suggesting that this part of the Nauvoo Expositor was a lie and did not reflect reality. Now, Brian Hales' basic premise is that the Expositor meant that if a woman rejected Joseph's proposal, then she was damned by having Joseph retaliate against her by ruining her reputation, allowing others to impugn her good name, or through other negative consequences. And you can see the blog post called Indecent Proposals for examples of this. Hales claims that since there are several examples of women who refused Joseph's proposals without consequence, then the Expositor is caught in a lie. Women who safely said nope. Hales goes on to provide documentation for 5 such women. Let's examine what Hales describes in each case and see if approaching the Expositor from this perspective reveals a vicious lie. First, Esther Johnson. The first example is that of Esther Johnson. Hales writes, quote, "Benjamin F. Johnson wrote of one rejection, relating that the prophet asked me for my youngest sister, Esther M. I told him she was promised in marriage to my wife's brother. He said, 'Well, let them marry, for it will all come right.' Johnson further quoted the prophet, 'If your sister is engaged, it is all right,' and then added, 'In the presence of my family, he talked to her on the subject, but as I had suspected, she was promised to be married. The counsel Joseph Smith gave to Esther in the setting is not mentioned, but it appears that there the matter ended. Esther and her future husband were married by Almon Babbitt in Nauvoo on April 4th, 1844. That's the end of Brian Hales' quote regarding Esther Johnson. Now, I recently wrote about the public availability of the Joseph F. Smith affidavit books. And the beauty of this is that you, as the reader, now have access to the full documentary record so you can examine quotes like this in their full context. This account of Esther M. comes in the affidavit given by Benjamin Franklin Johnson. His affidavit can be viewed here, and there's a link to archive.org, and a typescript of it can be viewed here. He also gave an account of this in his autobiography, which can be viewed here, and a brief allusion to it is in a letter to George F. Gibbs that you can find here, and each of these heres is a link to a source on usually archive.org. It is helpful to have an idea of the ages of the individuals involved during these events and their recollection. Benjamin F. Johnson was 25 years old at the time, and Esther, being born in 1828, making her 15 years old at the time Joseph, who was age 38, desired her for a wife. Now, it's worth noting that Benjamin's affidavit begins with his recollection of Joseph first introducing him to the doctrine of plural marriage and asking Benjamin to teach it to his 30-year-old sister Almira with the intention of having her become a plural wife. By this time, Joseph had already married another of Benjamin's older sisters, Delcina, sometime in 1842. Benjamin at first recoiled in horror at Joseph's instruction and proposal, but consented to follow the prophet's directives. Almira was not entirely convinced at first, but after learning that Hiram Smith himself initially doubted and had come around to accepting the principle, she consented to the union. They were married for time and eternity in April of 1843, and it is accepted that their union was consummated. And there's links throughout this article where you can go and see the actual sources where these the source for these narrative facts are taken from. In many cases, it's from direct testimony and affidavits from the people involved. Sometime later that year, then, Joseph asked Benjamin for his youngest sister, Esther. She, being 15 years old, was a minor. It is tempting at this point to raise the objection that since she was a minor, both Illinois and Nauvoo ordinances required that consent of her parents be obtained. An ordinance on marriage was passed in the Nauvoo City Council under then-Mayor John C. Bennett on the 17th of February, 1842, stating, quote, "All persons over the age of 17 years and females over the age of 14 years may contract and be joined in marriage, provided in all cases where either party is a minor, the consent of parents or guardians be first had." That's found in an ordinance on marriage from the Nauvoo City Council minutes that you can find on the Church History Library or archive.org. As such, Joseph would have to obtain consent from Esther's mother or father, not her older brother Benjamin. Now, it may be that since Esther's parents were separated at the time, Joseph considered Benjamin her guardian. Guidance for this consent issue is provided in Illinois law on obtaining consent for license of marriage. In Section 5, it says, "No such license shall be granted for the marriage of any male under 21 years of age or female under the age of 18 years without consent of his or her father, if he be dead or incapable of, or her mother or guardian, to be noted in such license." That's from the Revised Law of Illinois, 1833. Esther's father, Ezekiel Johnson Jr., was alive and lived within 3 miles in nearby Mentor. He was still in regular contact with his children and was even capable enough to be called upon to donate money to the church at times. As described, it is tempting to dig into the legal question of who could have or should have been asked to consent for marriage, but none of that really matters. Marriage to another person, regardless of age, was already illegal under the state's anti-bigamy laws. Section 121 of the Criminal Code, in effect at the time, stated, quote, Section 121, "Bigamy consists in having of 2 wives or 2 husbands at one time and the same time, knowing that the former husband or wife is still alive. If any person or persons within this state being married or who shall hereafter marry do at any time marry any person or persons, the former husband or wife being alive, the person so offending shall, on conviction thereof, be punished by a fine not exceeding $1,000 and imprisoned in the penitentiary not exceeding 2 years. It shall not be necessary to prove either of the said marriages by the register or certificate thereof or other record of evidence. but the same may be proved by such evidence as is admissible to prove a marriage in other cases. And when such second marriage shall have taken place without this state, cohabitation in this state after such second marriage shall be deemed the commission of the crime of bigamy, and the trial in such case may take place in the county where such cohabitation shall have occurred. This is from the Revised Laws of Illinois, published in 1833. You can see the source on archive.org. So, we've established that Mayor/Prophet/President/Lieutenant General Joseph Smith approached the 25-year-old brother of a 15-year-old minor to ask for an illegal marriage. Benjamin replied that she was already engaged to another man. He would write in a letter to George Gibbs that she was only partially promised. And rather than stop there, Joseph wanted that question investigated. Hales correctly points out that the content of the discussion that was had in front of the whole family is not known. It is very likely that Joseph's conversation only addressed the question of her existing engagement. That would not be a controversial topic in front of the whole family. A key point, which will be important later, is that there is no record that the intended proposal was ever made public beyond a private conversation between Joseph and Benjamin during the prophet's lifetime. The final observation is that there is no documentation that Joseph ever asked Esther herself to enter into marriage with him. As such, this example cannot be used as an argument to defend Joseph on this question. Now, as an aside, I really want to reiterate, Brian Hales makes a big point of not being able to claim anything if there's no documentation when he's talking about polyandry. His case repeatedly is that, well, if there's no documentation that they didn't have sex, then you can't assert that the polyandry was sexual. He's really strong on if there's no precise, unambiguous documentation, you can't make that claim. But here, he's using an inference that is even beyond unambiguous documentation because it is inherently ambiguous to try to bolster the assertion that Joseph Smith proposed to Esther Johnson and there were no consequences. So that's the case of Esther Johnson. Let's go on to the next case, Lydia Moon. Brian Hales, in his claim submission next, goes on to the case of Lydia Moon. Says Hales, quote, in another case, on September 15, 1843, William Clayton recorded an incident regarding Lydia Moon. He, meaning Joseph Smith, finally asked if I would not give Lydia Moon to him. I said I would so far as I had anything to do in it. He requested me to talk to her. 2 days later, Clayton wrote, I had some talk with Lydia. She seems to receive it kindly, but says she has promised her mother not to marry while her mother lives, and she thinks she won't. Lydia was not sealed to Joseph. This account is recorded in the journal of William Clayton. You can read the entire entries in full here, and there's a link to transcripts from the William Clayton Journal on archive.org. The church has, since the publication of this blog post, announced that it will make digitized and scanned versions of William Clayton's journal available in the future, so we'll be certainly interested to see that. The context of the example is interesting. Lydia Moon was a 17-year-old young woman who was the youngest of 3 sisters. She was William Clayton's sister-in-law, as Clayton had married the oldest Moon sister, Ruth, 7 years earlier in 1836 in his native Lancashire, England. He had immigrated along with the Moon family to join the Saints in 1840 and in time became personal secretary to Joseph Smith. Clayton was one of Joseph's closest confidants on the doctrine and practice of plural marriage. Since March of 1843, Joseph had been instructing Clayton in its practice, and Clayton had entered into plural marriage with the second Moon sister, Margaret, age 23, promptly in April of 1843. Joseph had initially instructed Clayton that, quote, it is your privilege to have all the wives you want. This can be found in a journal entry from William Clayton's journal, 9 March 1843. And again later, in that regard to plural wives, it was his right to get all you can. And it was likely with this in mind that Clayton himself set his sights on the youngest of the Moon sisters, Lydia. Clayton informed Joseph of his intentions, and it was at this point that Joseph intervened. The full journal entry, which Hale excerpted only a part of, is as follows. September 15th, 1843, Friday. A.M. at President Joseph's, afterwards at the temple office all day. Evening, President Joseph met me, and I returned with him to Orson Spencer's to borrow $1,400 to clear his farm from an encumbrance laying on it, which in fact Esquire Skinner's had ascertained on searching the records. President Joseph told me he had lately a new item of law revealed to him in relation to myself. He said the Lord had revealed to him that a man could only take two of a family except by express revelation, and as I had said I intended to take Lydia, he made this known for my benefit. To have more than two in a family was apt to cause wrangles and trouble. He finally asked if I would not give Lydia to him. I said I would, so far as I had anything to do in it. He requested me to talk to her. And that's from the William Clayton Journal dated 15 September 1843. Now, were it not for the fact that the revelation came from the Lord, it might have struck Clayton as odd that Joseph should stop him from pursuing a third sister after being given such encouragement to get all the wives he wanted or could, especially after Joseph had just attempted his own triple sister hat trick with Esther M. Johnson a few months prior, as described in the prior example. In a religious system that gets revelation line upon line and precept upon precept, however, such alterations may be expected. Clayton clearly sustained his prophet and offered no protest. And we can see the example of line upon line, precept upon precepts can be found in Animal Farm by Orson Welles, where initially the side of the wall said, and all animals are equal, but then later the side of the barn added, but some animals are more equal than others, line upon line, precept upon precept. It was fortunate that because of this new revelation, Lydia was once again fair game for Joseph. It might rouse your interest as a reader that Joseph was asking his secretary to give a young minor girl, his sister-in-law, to him. This young girl still lived with her mother, who was very capable of being asked for consent, and as we previously saw, the law would ultimately require that. Now, if you will allow me a brief diversion, I play a card game with my kids called Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, when you build a deck for battle, you can only have a maximum of 3 of any type of card in the deck. When my daughter tried to put 4 Dark Magician Girls in her deck, I informed her that that was an illegal move, and then I asked her if she would give me her extra Dark Magician Girl card because it is an awesome card that I wanted for my own deck. Cards are objects, possessions. They can be traded and treated as such. Talking about young women in such a way reveals a mindset and attitude towards women which is embarrassing. It may be that to judge Joseph in this way is a form of presentism, but treating women with respect and dignity and not as objects is a very low bar that the prophet of God in the final dispensation should reasonably be held to. Giving him the benefit of the doubt, perhaps Joseph would have eventually obtained consent from Mother Moon if required. In the meantime, 2 days later, William Clayton records that he approached Lydia about the proposal and she refused. He also notes that subsequently, on the 21st of September, Joseph himself spoke with Lydia on the matter and she did not consent, preferring to tarry with her sisters. This case, then, is an example of Mayor/Prophet/President/Lieutenant General Joseph receiving a revelation, tweaking the instructions on plural marriage just in time to prevent his secretary from proposing to a young woman whom Joseph himself desired as a plural wife. She rejected him with no apparent consequences. As such, this is an example that Brian Hales can reasonably cite in making his case. Again, it will be important later. There's no record of Lydia, Clayton, or any of the family making a public disclosure about this rejected proposal during the life of the prophet. That's going to be an important point, particularly in Part 3. Sarah Kimball. The next case study is that of Sarah Granger Kimball. Hales describes the circumstances of the rejected proposal. Another unsuccessful proposal occurred with Sarah Granger Kimball, who was legally married to non-Mormon Hiram Kimball. And again, this is Brian Hales providing his examples. Early in 1842, Joseph Smith taught me the principle of marriage for eternity and the doctrine of plural marriage. He said that in teaching this, he realized that he jeopardized his life, but God had revealed it to him many years before as a privilege with blessings. Now God had revealed it again and instructed him to teach with commandment, as the church could travel, meaning progress, no further without the introduction of this principle. I asked him to teach it to someone else. He looked at me reprovingly and said, "Will you tell me who to teach it to? God required me to teach it to you and leave you with the responsibility of believing or disbelieving." He said, "I will not cease to pray for you, and if you will seek unto God in prayer, you will not be led into temptation." After this described snub, Sarah Kimball sent Joseph Smith on his way. His response was to encourage her and to pray for her. That's the end of Brian Hales making the case that Joseph Smith was able to propose to Sarah Kimball, and she received no consequences for turning him down. Sarah's account is found in Jensen's historical record, which you can see the source of at archive.org. In 1842, she was a 24-year-old woman who had already married 2 years previously. It is notable that when you consider the warning that is included in the Revelation on polygamy in section 132, verses 4, then Joseph Smith's statement that God required me to teach it to you and leave you with the responsibility of believing or disbelieving is not encouragement. It is a tacit spiritual threat. Remember that the Revelation warned that those who would reject the principle would be damned. In 1842, it was a tumultuous time in Nauvoo, specifically around the issue of plural marriage. A description of the events would eventually be published in the Times and Seasons of 1 July 1842. In that publication, it was recounted that John C. Bennett, close confidant to Joseph Smith and mayor of Nauvoo, had been caught engaging in a practice of spiritual wifery and had implicated Joseph in his activities by stating that Joseph had taught and was practicing the same. After several calls to repentance for his activities, Bennett's activities did not cease, and Bennett went so far as to recruit other men into his practice on his word that Joseph endorsed it. Given Bennett's high position in both the church and city government, such events were subject to much rumor and discussion. In view of Bennett's activities and recalcitrance, Bennett was formally excommunicated on the 18th of June, 1842. On the 19th of May, the Nauvoo City Council had met, and then the disgraced Bennett resigned from his position as mayor. During the same meeting, Bennett was questioned by Joseph, and Bennett declared that at no time had Joseph given him authority or license to engage in illicit intercourse. And when pressed to comment specifically on Joseph's character, Bennett attested that in all my intercourse with General Smith, in public and in private, he has been strictly virtuous. Curiously, it was also in this very meeting that a revelation was received by Joseph Smith firsthand from the Lord. It came during the vote to elect the new mayor. Joseph wrote it on a piece of paper and tossed it across the room towards City Councilor Hiram Kimball, the husband of Sarah Kimball. The revelation read as follows, quote, "Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph, by the voice of my spirit. Hiram Kimball has been insinuating evil and forming evil opinions against you with others. And if he continue in them, he and they shall be accursed. For I am the Lord thy God, and will stand by thee and bless thee. Amen." Revelation given to Joseph Smith, 19 May 1842. And you can see the source of that on Joseph Smith Papers' website. But what were these evil insinuations and opinions? The historians at the Joseph Smith Papers Project have provided some helpful context, and a footnote on that website reads as follows. The evil opinions mentioned in this revelation may refer to the growing friction between Joseph Smith and various Nauvoo businessmen like Hiram Kimball, over the latter's promoting their own projects ahead of those of the church. Alternatively, or in addition, they may have had something to do with the principle of plural marriage, which Joseph Smith reportedly taught to Kimball's wife, Sarah Granger, about this time, and which she rejected. In spite of their differences, Joseph Smith and Hiram Kimball remained cordial, and Kimball joined the church the following year. And that's footnote 204 from the Joseph Smith Papers website. Now, these historians are very specific with their wording. Note that Joseph taught her the principle of plural marriage, and she rejected the principle. Neither Sarah Kimball's testimony nor the footnote here state that he specifically proposed to her. Since a proposal usually followed instruction in the doctrine, we assume that there was a proposal of marriage which she rejected, but she does not specifically state that in her testimony. It is entirely possible that she was so immediately incensed at the doctrine and vocally opposed to it that the prophet never got the chance to pop the question. Sarah was not a shrinking violet. Hales is famous for adamantly refusing to accept a sexual relationship between Joseph and a plural wife unless there is very specific and unambiguous language from a reliable witness declaring it to be so. Applying that same standard to the question at hand would allow it to be a reasonable assertion that we cannot prove that Joseph, in fact, proposed to Sarah Kimball. Whether there was a proposal or not, Sarah Kimball now knew that Joseph himself was secretly teaching a doctrine of plural marriage in 1842. While she herself kept the prophet's secret from the public, it is justifiably assumed that she informed her husband Hiram of the matter. Certainly, Joseph would have been wary of that likelihood. Now, just a few months later, in May of 1842, Hiram is sitting as an alderman in the city council meeting where the disgraced mayor, John C. Bennett, has been caught teaching a form of spiritual wifery that Hiram has no way of knowing is any different from Joseph Smith's celestial marriage, because Joseph had not publicly given a sermon on the details of the matter and was publicly denying any form of marriage other than monogamy, as found in what was then Doctrine and Covenants, section 101. To any outside observer at the time, Hiram included, there could be no way to know a difference between what Bennett was doing and what Joseph Smith was doing. Hiram could only view Joseph's actions as the basest form of hypocrisy, condemning and ousting a man for teaching and doing the very thing he believed Joseph to have attempted upon his own wife. It should not be surprising for Hiram to have communicated this perceived hypocrisy to others in his circle. It is reasonable to consider that the prophet heard of it and the resulting revelation was in reference to that rumor. This revelation, received right in the middle of a city council meeting, had the Lord addressing Hiram Kimball by name and giving a warning under the threat of being accursed. Hiram was not a member of the church at that time and may not have had a high opinion of Joseph's prophetic claims, but such a statement from a man in Joseph's position is actually more ominous if you don't hold him to be a man of God. I do not believe that Hiram took the revelation lightly. The subsequent vote for the new mayor to replace Bennett came in with 18 votes in favor of Joseph and a single opposed vote opting for William Marks instead. The vote was by ballot, so we will never know who cast the dissenting vote, but if I were a betting man, my money would be on Hiram. And I think others have pointed out, well, it may have been William Marks, but I don't know if Marks was willing to oppose Joseph himself. So in this case, we have Prophet, President, Lieutenant General Joseph teaching the principle of plural marriage to an already devotedly married woman who immediately and forcefully rejects it. We have no proof of an actual proposal. Importantly, Sarah Kimball herself never made any public disclosure of the matter, and she personally saw no repercussions. However, there is compelling circumstantial evidence that her husband may have spread insinuations of Joseph's principle only to have the prophet declare that the Almighty Creator himself was ready to interrupt a city council meeting and curse him if he continued in that purpose. As such, this is not a case that can be reasonably used to support Hales' claim. Now, I want to point out that Hales has gone through great lengths to try to make the case that Joseph Smith did not practice polyandry. And yet, in this case, he's using an example, and Hales is asserting that Joseph Smith proposed to Kimball here. He's trying to say that you can use this as an example that Joseph Smith could have his proposals rejected safely. So in this case, Brian Hales is saying that Joseph proposed to this already married woman, which would mean that Joseph was trying to enter into polyandry. And so this is where the disconnect with Brian Hales' arguments just comes out into the open, because you can only examine his arguments in isolation in order for them to make sense. If you look at all the different arguments he makes in different areas of trying to defend Joseph, he contradicts himself, and this is one example of that. Let's go on to the next case. Next, we have Cordelia Morley. Next up is the account of Cordelia Morley. Hales submits the following. This is Hales now describing his example of Cordelia Morley. Cordelia Morley recounted a similar situation. In the spring of 44, plural marriage was introduced to me by my parents from Joseph Smith, asking their consent and a request to me to be his wife. Imagine, if you can, my feelings to be a plural wife, something I never thought I ever could. I knew nothing of such religion and could not accept it. Neither did I. However, Cordelia had second thoughts and was sealed to the prophet after his death. That's the end of Hales' points on that case. The record of Cordelia's testimony is found in her autobiography, and a typescript excerpt is available here. Confirmation of her intimate knowledge of Joseph's polygamy can be found in a biographical sketch from the 1913 Women's Exponent that you can see on archive.org. And further context is found in recollections collected by the Cox family, her descendants, in another source on archive.org. In 1844, Cordelia was the 21-year-old daughter of Isaac and Lucy Morley. In 1831, Joseph and his family stayed with the Morley family until the Smith home could be built. Her father had owned a large farm in Kirtland, which he had been commanded by the Lord in D&C Section 64 to sell for the benefit of the church. That he did so was a testament to his devotion to Joseph. He subsequently served a mission, was appointed bishop, ordained a patriarch, and appointed as stake president. There is a whole seminary lesson dedicated to his example of sacrifice and obedience. As such, it is not surprising for Joseph to have taught the principle to Isaac and his wife. Isaac had previously had the experience of being rebuked by name in a revelation from the Lord, found in D&C 64, where it reads, "Behold, I, the Lord, was angry with him who was my servant Ezra Booth, and also my servant Isaac Morley, for they kept not the law, neither the commandment. They sought evil in their hearts, and I, the Lord, withheld my spirit. They condemned for evil that thing in which there was no evil. Nevertheless, I have forgiven my servant Isaac Morley." That's from D&C 64, verses 15 and 16. As such, he would have great incentive for trusting and believing a new doctrine from the prophet, even if the thing he teaches might appear to be evil at first impression. As we saw with Hiram Kimball, the Lord was not afraid to rebuke men who crossed Joseph's purposes. Though Cordelia was groomed to accept the doctrine and proposal by hearing it first from her beloved parents, that did not prevent her from rejecting the offer. The account of the proposal collected by the Cox family includes her reply to the prophet. It reads, "I told the prophet I had a sweetheart. His name was Whiting, and I expected to marry him. He, however, was left by the wayside. He could not endure the persecutions and hardships. I told the prophet I thought him a wonderful man and a leader, but I wanted to marry my sweetheart." And that's from the Cordelia Cox autobiography, which you can read on archive.org. So, in this instance, despite grooming a young woman to receive his proposal by having her parents introduce the doctrine beforehand, Mayor, Prophet, President, Lieutenant General Joseph is still rebuffed, and no negative consequences follow the refusal. As such, it is reasonable for Hales to include this example in making his case. Again, it is important to note that Cordelia and her family kept the proposal and their knowledge of Joseph's doctrine and practice of plural marriage a secret from the public until the date she penned her autobiography in 1909, a full 65 years later. Rachel Ivins. The final example of a proposal refused without retribution or consequence that Hales provides is that of Rachel Ivins. Hales states, "Another rejection was chronicled by Rachel Ivins' biographer. When Joseph sought an interview with her, meaning Rachel, she believed he wished to ask for her hand in plural marriage. Her personal turmoil over this prospect must have been excruciating. Despite Rachel Ivins' initial response, she was also sealed to Joseph Smith by proxy in the endowment house in Salt Lake City on November 29, 1855. And that's the end of Hales' quote there. 21-year-old Rachel Ivins had been orphaned at a young age and had grown up among her relatives in the New Jersey area. Her cousins, Charles and James Ivins, were successful merchants who joined the church, and Rachel joined them when they relocated to Nauvoo in the spring of 1842. Living in relative style and comfort with her cousin James and his family, Rachel became close friends with Sarah Granger Kimball, the young, strong-willed feminist who rejected Joseph's teaching of plural marriage. The Ivins heard rumors of Joseph's polygamy, and when Rachel learned of Joseph's desire for an interview with her, it is possible that Sarah warned Rachel that Joseph's intentions were that of a plural marriage proposal. Rachel's son, Heber J. Grant, would later become prophet. And in 1836, he wrote of his mother's experience in a letter now found in the restricted church archives. The relevant quote is as follows. I want to tell you a little of my mother's life. She was in Nauvoo, and she admired and loved the prophet Joseph Smith, as all of the people did, almost beyond their power of expression. Hearing that he was teaching plural marriage, and that he undoubtedly was going to propose marriage to her, in order to avoid it, she went back to Toms River, New Jersey, with the classical expression that she would sooner go to hell as a virtuous woman than to go to heaven as a whore. It was the only expression of the kind that I have ever heard quoted as coming from her. But in the providences of the Lord, she became converted beyond a doubt that plural marriage, properly practiced, was all right, and that the Lord had really given the revelation to Joseph Smith to introduce plural marriage among the faithful saints. And you can see this in a letter from Heber J. Grant to Ray O. Weiland, dated 12 December 1936, found in the Church History Library, and you can find a typescript of it on archive.org, as well as at Brian Hales' website, MormonPolygamyDocuments.org. Now, while avoiding an interview with Joseph, she did not leave Nauvoo until late 1844, where she would remain apart from the saints until almost 10 years later, while she journeyed to Utah in 1853. She ultimately accepted the principle of plural marriage and became the seventh wife of Jedediah M. Grant. Even though there is no documentation that Joseph ever met with Rachel for a proposal, there is evidence that Joseph had already called dibs on her eternal companionship. In 1942 General Conference address, her son, President Heber J. Grant, recalled, quote, "I had always understood and known that my mother was sealed to the prophet, and that Brigham Young had told my father that he would not marry my mother to him for eternity because he had instructions from the prophet that if anything happened to him before he was married to Rachel Ivins, she must be sealed to him for eternity, and that she belonged to him." This is from the Improvement Era, 1942, My Call to the Apostleship, a citation from the 1842 General Conference. Now, I've called dibs on things before. The seat right under the air conditioning vent, the peanut butter and jelly sandwich with the most raspberry jam, and being the character of the wizard in the Gauntlet video game. In none of those instances did I have to consult the object of my dibs because they were objects, possessions. They didn't get a say in the matter because they could have no say. It would appear that Joseph treated the eternal existence of women he desired in much the same way. Joseph had called dibs on Rachel's eternal life. Indeed, Rachel was only sealed to her earthly parent, or to her earthly husband Jedediah, for time, and it was the prophet Joseph to whom she was sealed for eternity. This means that all of Rachel's children were also sealed to Joseph in the eternities rather than their earthly father as well. This may have been the best, however, because if you recall, Jedediah was a very fiery and vocal proponent of blood atonement, and I don't know that one would want to be in such company for the eternities. So in this instance, Mayor, Prophet, President, Lieutenant General Joseph claimed the eternal companionship of a young woman without consulting her, and she was so offended by the idea that the prophet would propose such a thing that she avoided meeting with him to give him a chance. As such, there was no proposal, and Hales cannot reasonably use this example to support his argument. Hales' summary. Hales goes on to summarize his point on these rejections. Quote, "All 5 of these rejections came and went unbeknownst to most Nauvooans. According to available records, these women suffered no consequences at Joseph Smith's hand, directly or indirectly, for spurning him. Had the woman not personally recounted the events afterwards, knowledge of the proposals may have been lost to later generations." And that's the end of Brian Hales' quote there. Now, this is where paying attention to what we can actually confidently say happened based on the documentation, as well as looking at what was publicly known at the time of the expositor, is essential. So, now for the response. Part 2, proposal documented? Now, first, it should be pointed out that the 5 examples that Hales provides, only 2 cases actually have documentation that unambiguously supports an actual proposal being made. The other cases are ambiguous or contradict the occurrence of a proposal. For Esther Johnson, we have no documented proposal. For Lydia Moon, there is a proposal documented. For Sarah Granger Kimball, no documented proposal. For Cordelia Morley, there is a documented proposal. But for Rachel Ivins, no documented proposal. This observation is not the only one, however, known to the expositor. Hales himself acknowledges that these accounts did not come out until years after the death of Joseph Smith. They were unbeknown to most Nauvooans. The publishers of the Expositor had no way of knowing about these possible proposals. They only knew about the proposals that had been made public. As such, the statements of the Expositor and the honesty of the men who authored them can only be assessed based on what they could have known. This is not a new concept. Remember the good faith exception from the article False Witnesses and Lost Credibility, where several men and women signed a certificate declaring that there was no polygamy in the church, only to find out later that Joseph had been practicing the principle. Before calling such men dishonest, you have to consider what one of them said about the matter. Quote, in October 1842, a statement was written out and signed by a large number of the brethren and sisters, including myself and wife, setting forth the fact that we knew of no other form of marriage ceremony in the church except the one published in the book Doctrine and Covenants, which statement was true at the time. We had no knowledge of such a ceremony, or that spiritual wifery or polygamy was taught by the heads of the church, as they had not up to that time taught it to us. That is a quote from Ebenezer Robinson from his personal history published in The Return in 1891. Now, the authors of the Expositor could only describe and make conclusions based on the cases that had been publicly disclosed. As I wrote about in the Indecent Proposals articles, each of these cases that Joseph knew had significant negative consequences for making their rejected proposals public. It was reasonable and in good faith that the Expositor described the consequences of rejected proposals as such. Since these proposals were not publicly known to the Expositor during Joseph's lifetime, the authors could not have been accused of publishing a vicious lie if they had made the case that Joseph retaliated against any woman who rejected a marriage proposal, which they didn't. At most, they would have published an accusation which was made in error in good faith. This occasionally happens in printed media. For example, Joseph had a handbill of affidavits and certificates disproving the statements and affidavits contained in John C. Bennett's letters. He had this handbill printed to counter Bennett's accusations. One of the affidavits Joseph included was from Stephen Markin, who accused Nancy Rigdon of illicit behavior with Bennett. Now remember, Nancy Rigdon is the 19-year-old daughter of Signe Rigdon, who famously rejected Joseph Smith's proposal and made the letter he wrote, known as the Happiness Letter, available to the public. The affidavit read as followed. Quote, personally came before me Ebenezer Robinson, a justice of the peace in and for said county, Stephen Markin, who, being duly sworn according to law, deposeth and saith that on the blank day of blank, A.D. 1842, he was at the house of Sidney Rigdon in the city of Nauvoo, where he saw Miss Nancy Rigdon laying on a bed, and John C. Bennett was sitting by the side of the bed near the foot, in close conversation with her. Deponent also saw many vulgar and unbecoming indecent sayings and motions pass between them, which satisfied deponent that they were guilty of unlawful and illicit intercourse with each other. Stephen Markham. And this is from that handbill, affidavits and certificates regarding John C. Bennett's letters. Now, it appears that this accusation may have been an error. Joseph subsequently instructed a retraction to be published, which was found in The Wasp, the Nauvoo newspaper. And it read as follows, quote, we are authorized to say by General Joseph Smith that the affidavit of Stephen Markham relative to Miss Nancy Rigdon as published in the handbill of affidavits was unauthorized by him, meaning Joseph Smith, the certificate of Elder Rigdon relative to the letter being satisfactory. Now, the entire sequence of this exchange and the precise wording used by the parties involved is actually very interesting, but it's beyond the scope of this discussion. It's sufficient to observe that the statements made in error but in good faith are not vicious lies and have been made even by the church and its supporters. Conclusion of Part 2. To be clear, we've already determined that the specific statement of the Expositor is not a vicious lie, in that it is a reference to the warning given in the Revelation on polygamy as demonstrated in Part 1 of this response to Brian Hales' submission. Setting that aside, if we look closely at the case Hales makes about these 5 women, who he suggests refused Joseph's advances without consequence, we can see that his argument is much weaker than he paints it to be, with only 2 of the 5 cases actually showing a documented proposal. Close examination of the circumstances around the proposals unfortunately reveals a number of embarrassing things. It shows that Joseph referred to these women in terms that appear to dehumanize and objectify them, treating them as possessions. It also shows that he may have been inclined to skirt established laws and customs in obtaining consent, which is not surprising given the unconventional and illegal nature of the unions he was proposing. It shows that Joseph received convenient revelations, such as one blocking his secretary from pursuing a woman Joseph was interested in, and another threatening the husband of one of his failed attempts during a key election. If Hales intends to use these women to help restore doubting members' confidence in Joseph as an honorable man, he may run into problems. Exposing investigators to these embarrassing facts will only raise more questions, which will require even deeper rationales and explanations, which I'm not certain Hales is prepared to provide, since he appears to have narrowly confined his assessment of Joseph to the issue of celestial marriages and sealings. Furthermore, even if the expositor made the case that Hales is asserting, which it did not, since the statements were made without the knowledge of rejections that went unretaliated, they could, at most, be considered false accusations made in good faith, not vicious lies. If the statements were false, then Joseph could have issued a correction allowing for a retraction to be published in the next issue of the Expositor. Joseph himself had previously had to do just that. Such a sequence was not possible, however, because Joseph immediately orchestrated the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor press after its publication. Now, all of these observations serve to weaken the case that Hales is making to defend Joseph, but they are not the central problem with Hales' position. In Part 3, the final installment of my response to Hales, I will examine the underlying problem which completely nullifies the case that Hales is making regarding Joseph and the women who said nope. All right, and that is the end of our article there. So, with that being out of the way, let's go ahead and open up the phone lines. If you would like to give us a little bit of your impression of this particular case that Hales makes, or some experiences that you've had, be very interested to hear from you. Let me go ahead and just pull up our phone system. The number to call is 210-422-2222. Again, you can call 210-422-2222 and share any of the thoughts or comments that you have. Let's see what we have in terms of comments. Colleen Johnston says, "Who documents having sex? Ridiculous." This is a very common response to Hales' position, which is that, short of children being produced as direct evidence of sexual interaction, there's very few instances where you're going to find anyone in the 1840s documenting that they had sex. I'm trying to think of, when that could be. The only example that I can think of would be, very, very early on in the 1600s. In England, John Dee, the conjurer to the Queen, kept a very detailed journal of his interactions with angels through the use of a seer scryer, Edward Kelly. And in his journal, they figured out that he put little code marks for when he had sex with his wife. But that was because part of his preparation for those angelic conversations was that a period of time had to have elapsed since he had sex so that he was considered clean. I mean, there's just very few instances where we're going to have unambiguous evidence that Joseph Smith engaged in sex with his plural marriage. But if you set an impossible standard for meeting that criteria, then it works to your benefit if you're trying to exonerate Joseph. All right. Hey, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
John Streeter, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Hey, Jonathan Streeter, you magnificent bastard. How are you?
I'm doing good. This could only be Gimpy Geezer.
It is so true. John, this is a pretty interesting episode. You hit me with something I have not heard before. And I watched the slide, but I can't think of his name. Who was it? He went in, Joseph Smith went to the vote, and he wrote a revelation and threw it at him. Who was the guy?
Hiram Kimball.
Okay. And this note says, "Thus saith the Lord," blah, 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 right?
Yep.
I've never heard that. Could you imagine the power, the intimidation? I only wish that the Lord would back me up in my life with all these small things and dealings with people in such a way would be great, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to go throw a note to my wife, crumpled up. Thus saith the Lord, I will be displeased unless the toilet paper hangs from the top and not the bottom. And thus saith the Lord, you shall make my servant a sandwich and shall fail, because the Lord knows your comings and goings. And the last time a sandwich was made, that it was slathered. Yes, it was slathered in mayonnaise. So what a wow. And back in the day, right? What intimidation. I mean, I can't believe it. That is just...
Oh, no, there's a whole article that I hope to be able to eventually make under the heading of the convenient self-serving revelations of Joseph Smith. I mean, this happens again and again where God, thus saith the Lord, has some revelation which either exonerates Joseph or commands the members of the church to support him financially or in some way benefits Joseph. And, when we go out and we see like some other religious charlatan be like, yeah, God said you have to give me your wife. You'd be like, yeah, God's not really saying that. That's really you just using the name of God to do that. But when we see Joseph Smith do the same thing, we just like, oh, it's true. It's real. He's the prophet.
It's amazing to me that he was who he was. Not only the exact opposite of how he's portrayed in the church, beyond staggering opposite. I mean, unbelievable. But you know what, John? I swear, this would be the best series ever. And Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, they have nothing what happened in Joseph Smith's real life. Of course, it couldn't be that. It couldn't be in the libraries of our elementary schools. This would be HBO, right?
No, it would have to be, yeah.
Joseph Smith's story with all his wheeling and dealing and craziness. He lived a life. He did not sit around. He was always on the go. And also, here's my problem. I listen to lots of podcasts and stuff, and have for a good while. It's very interesting. I'm kind of hooked on the real church history now because it's just fascinating to me. But what it is, I will hear something, and then I will, that's very interesting, and kind of put it in my mental notebook, but I don't have the sources. So if I talk about it, it's like, I don't have the source. I don't know. So I need to pay more attention to sources or something. But my understanding was that Joseph Smith had these sexual allegation charges. He's hit with these sex charges or whatever all the time, all kinds of different states. There's lots of running Joseph out of town type stuff, or him taking off to go hide because he's on the lam for some trouble he got into, and of course the story where they wanted to castrate him, and then the doctor who was going to do it didn't have the heart to do that. But I thought it was interesting that they wanted to castrate him. I don't remember who he was after, but it wasn't just tar and feather or beating him or running him out of town on a rail, which I believe happened to him. All this happened to him, but they wanted to castrate him, and I think it's because he was yet again fooling around.
Yeah, you may be referring to a document that Grant Palmer put together, which was a collection of all the different allegations of sexual impropriety that he made the case plagued Joseph even before Nauvoo and the polygamy revelation. And Brian Hales has addressed that document. And there were some problems with the case that Grant made in that some of the sources that he used were later sources that I think Brian Hales did a good response, specifically on the case that you mentioned, which is Palmer had made the case that castration was something that was a response to Joseph Smith being improper with Nancy Miranda Hyde Johnson, who later was a plural wife of Joseph. And Hale's response said that, the source that allegation comes from gets some of the relationships wrong. The people that he says were there were not actually there. And so we can't actually use that case reliably. And I think there's a case to be made from Hale's perspective on that. The problem is that story, because it involves persecution of Joseph Smith, does not just get used by anti-Mormons or critics of Joseph. Because it involves persecution, it also gets used by people trying to defend Joseph, saying that he was subject to persecution, and it kind of feeds that persecution context narrative. And so there's a famous, I think LDS Living quoted some BYU historian who was citing that instance, specifically talking about the castration. But you can't have it both ways. You can't have the castration for persecution without picking up the other end of the stick, which is that the castration was specifically alleged to be a response to sexual impropriety with a young woman who at that time was like 15 or 16 or something like that. Right. And you might say that's like, it's not related, but like so many of these cases, later we find that Joseph did get married to that woman who the allegation was made about. So you have to say there may have been some, where there's smoke, there's fire to that, but it's not something that you want to use as a definitive statement or a definitive argument.
Right, and I am no scholar or anything, but I do see that's kind of the trouble with church history. You hear so many interesting things. For instance, just one stuck out of my mind when you were talking. There's a newspaper article. See, because the newspapers back then, Joe became kind of a star. People were always kind of interested in what they had to say, and so I've actually seen several newspaper articles about old Joe Smith. Is what they called it. A lot of them called him. So he was kind of back in the day, he's got press. But one time was that supposedly he was mimicking an angel or something, and somebody busted him. He said something like, "Oh, an angel will appear," or whatever, and he was dressed up like an angel, and some roughnecks of the town went and rounded him up and all that. And so that was so. Here's this little obscure little newspaper article. It's like, well, is that true? Did it happen or whatever? And so you don't have credible sources, so you can't really hold on to it to make a case or whatever. But when you see so many of these unusual little tidbits running around, another one I can't remember the source was I don't know, some governor was visiting or something, or some high, political thing, and he was allowed to speak to the saints. I think it was in Nauvoo, and Joe Smith reportedly said to him, these are some of the, these are wonderful people. These are some of the best dupes ever. And he actually used the word dupe to say. So did that happen? I don't know. But when you actually have credible things all piled together, and then about these other things, you really draw a very interesting narrative for this character. I think Joseph Smith was fascinating. And I also think he was a Casanova. And I think some of the ladies were kind of hot for Joe. I think he really had. I think he was a sincere, hardcore player. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think he was clearly very charismatic and clearly held great sway. And I think if you just acknowledge that humans are humans and they can be attracted to power, women can be attracted to power despite that. I even encounter people today who are historians that acknowledge the problem with history. And I remember one historian who is an author and a researcher, happens to be a woman, talking to me is like, I have a hard time reading about these difficult things about Joseph because I just love him. And I know if I was alive back then, if he proposed to me, I would have accepted right away, even knowing everything. And so, he had a magnetism to him that was part of his influence on others. And, like you were talking about earlier, when I was in the church, like it'd be like, okay, Sunday school this year, what are we studying? Church history? It was just like so boring. But when you leave the church and you actually get to explore these personalities and these events in a way that's not filtered and whitewashed, it is intensely fascinating. And I fell in love with church history and just reading and learning and being able to discuss and debate these things because it is so fascinating. And if HBO did a series, there would be murder, intrigue, counterfeiting, sex, treason. There would be like all these different things that would be the elements in the story that would be so compelling and convincing. Especially on the backdrop of post-colonial America, it would be very interesting.
It would be very interesting, and if they did it, if they were accurate, and it was HBO, there would be boobies in every episode. I know there would be, because it has to be. All right, hey, great episode. This is fascinating. Always great. You really got me going here, so I wanted to call in. But all
right.
Hey, I made my youngest son. I cracked him up. I've sent something to you. I want you to look at it. I hope it cracks you up. All right. You take care.
I'll check it out. All right, take care. Bye. All right, so the phone line is now open, 210-422-2222. If you would like to call and share some of your perspective on what we're talking about today. We examined the arguments that Brian Hales made. Let's go ahead and see what we have. Hello, this is Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hello.
Hello. If you want to mute, I can hear you. If you want to mute your computer or TV in the background, it'll be easier to hear you.
Oh yeah, my name is Cesar. I'm from Brazil,
Oh, hi.
and it's very interesting to me as, for example, a South American guy to know about Mormon polygamy because here on Brazil, people no they see two men walking on the street. One of them is American, and usually the other one is a Brazilian guy, and people don't know about Mormon history. And
Mhm.
I have some friends who are active LDS, and 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 I went to church with them for some weeks, and and I found very interesting to learn about the polygamy because you know I can't imagine another man coming to me and say, "Oh, God, He commanded me to have your wife." This is impossible for me.
That experience where Joseph would go to a man and say, God commanded me to have your wife, was something that the church acknowledges was part of Joseph's testing of his apostles. And they compare it to an Abrahamic test. They say that, Joseph went to Heber
Oh
Kimball
yeah,
and said, God commanded me to give your wife. And then the story goes that Heber really wrestled with it and then came to Joseph and said, oh, okay, I'll give it to you. And it was a test of loyalty. And Joseph said, I don't really want it. It was just a test. But the thing is, those tests of loyalty show that people are able to transgress moral boundaries on the strength of their belief in the divine calling of a person. And that's not a good thing. You don't want an organization to have such a
oh
strong
yeah.
message of obedience that people betray their own conscience and what they believe to be right to do that. So I don't see it as a faith promoting story. I see it as a horrific story. As you're pointing out, who would ever do this?
I sometimes I feel like, oh my God, what kind of drug these guys were using? Because if, what kind of man will go to another man proposing something like that?
Yeah, and the thing is, you see this type of loyalty test being done in other totalistic religions where there's a very charismatic, powerful leader who claims some sort of divine special permission to do things. And what they'll do is they'll ask things of their close inner circle that are far beyond the pale of what would be normally permissible. And if the person accepts, they'll say, okay, it was just a test. But that then primes them to obey other things that they get commanded to do. And as we've seen in church history, that will include lying to both members as well as outsiders in order to cover up Joseph's activities. We even have examples early in church history where sitting apostles had to testify in court cases where people said, Joseph tried to kill me. And the apostles said, well, yeah, Joseph said that it would be okay if this man was put out of the way and that God would be, okay with it. And so even something like murder can be excused if a prophet commands it. And we see this reflected in the happiness letter given to Nancy Rigdon as well. So it's crazy stuff. The drug that you're talking about is really just the psychological reality of the type of influence that a charismatic person can have over believing people and all of the power dynamics, all of the social pressure, everything else that goes into that we're, more than happy to acknowledge will happen in Scientology or some other group. It's just harder to see it when it's part of your own group.
Yeah. The first time I was reading Todd M. Compton, and I was reading No Man Knows My History too.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was fascinating to know how Joseph Smith could do that with people.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, if you believe that it's real, if you believe that he actually does speak for God and that God is communicating with him, and you live in, a time of history where people are very close to that notion of the reality of God in the religious paradigm that Joseph is using, then you see yourself as not really obeying Joseph, you're obeying God, because that's what Joseph is drawing in an equal line between himself and God, in terms of what I tell you, what Joseph tells you is what God tells you. And that's powerful stuff. And, so we see the result of it.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
it's not clear to me, you were a member of the church, or you just had friends that were members of the church?
I'm not a member of the church. I just have friends who are active LDS.
Okay. It's just so unusual for someone who's not a member of the church to be reading No Man Knows My History. It's a fascinating read, to be sure.
Can you repeat the final?
Sure. No, it's a fascinating book. It's just unusual for someone who's not a member of the church to be reading No Man Knows My History, a history of Joseph Smith written, decades ago.
Wow, it was my first book. I have No Man Knows My History, okay, Totem Compton, and I have a biography of Sidney Rigdon. I don't remember the author, but that's okay. And the last one. I don't know if any of your audience know, but on Brazil we have a man claiming to have translated the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon.
Yes, I've seen both the posts on that, as well as he's even published some pictures of the plates, has he not, and the Sword of Laban?
Yeah, and they don't believe Joseph Smith practiced polygamy.
Really? Oh. Are you in communication with anybody in the group?
Yes. I know two of them.
What is so if you're approaching it with a outsider view of the history of Joseph Smith, what is your impression of them?
Well,
is there, I guess for me, the first question would be, is there a charismatic person at the center of that movement, someone who themselves claims to be, in the context of what we had, it'd have to be someone claiming to be the one mighty and strong who was going to save the gospel or whatever.
Yes, and he claims to be the Joseph Smith.
Oh, a reincarnation of Joseph Smith.
Yes, and one of his followers are Adam and Hiram Smith.
Really? Okay. Now, is that, I saw that there was a descendant of Parley P. Pratt or Ocean Pratt, someone that they're referring to as Dr. Pratt, who is validating their claims about it.
They use this guy to say, wow, our movement is true because that guy with the name of Pratt is following us.
Yes, exactly. It's one of those, it's like trying to use name association to try to give validity to it. How big is the group getting?
Wow. Some months ago, they have people leaving the movement because they found out it was a fraud. And I don't know, maybe 40 people. 40.
Wow, okay. Did they actually produce...
The size of a steak.
Yeah, did they actually produce a book that's the translation, or did they just claim to have translated it, the sealed portion?
No, the guy said he translated from the plates of Moroni.
Did he ever release what the translation was, so you could read it?
No, no. Never.
Okay, so he just claimed, yeah, I translated it, but you can't read it. In America, we have a guy named Chris Nemelka who several years ago claimed to have translated the sealed portion, and he published it. And when you read it, it is actually really interesting because it taps into all of these open ends that are left in the scriptural story of the Book of Mormon and in the gospel in general. So you have like the brother of Jared visiting other worlds and interacting with his spirit mom, because God was a polygamist. And so some of us may be descendant from one of God's wives and others may be descended from another of God's wives. And it's just like, it's tying into these things that have an air of believability from doctrine and seem like even deeper doctrine. And it's just, he clearly put a lot of effort into it. And that makes it even, interesting from the fan fiction perspective. But to the extent that someone can produce something like that and then gain followers who then give them power, influence, wealth, that's where the danger comes in.
Oh yeah, I know that. Man, he took pictures of the plates, and there are guys who say that, oh, I'm a witness of the golden plates and that another, but he never, show it to the media. For example, TV or a journal. Nobody. I said, why don't you go to the near university and show the professors up there?
It's too sacred.
It's too sacred.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's the way it is. If you're a magician and you're trying to pull off a scam, you have to always control the environment in which your trick is being played. And I think it's the same thing. As soon as you give unrestricted access to the media, then you've lost control of the environment, and that's a problem.
Oh yeah, and there is a woman from United States that she left the movement and she's saying they are liars. They just wanted her money.
Well, now she's an apostate, and you can't believe her because she just is trying to tear down the prophet.
Yeah, and they talk very bad about her.
Yeah, that's the same pattern that existed back then. So what do you tell your friends who are your friends conventional Mormons, or are they following this group?
They're conventional Mormons, and
Okay.
I don't like to talk about Mormon history with them because something that is a lie. This is a lie. Everything you say is not true. The prophet is true. The church is true. They don't want to listen.
Yeah. And that gets in the way of your friendship. And if you value your friendship above all else, then it's reasonable to just kind of not make that the primary point of your conversation. That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your call. Take care. All right. Let's see. It's interesting when, we have God himself in the middle of the city council meeting giving a revelation. Last week, I was trying to make sense of these arguments that Brian Hales makes. And you say like an angel commanded, Joseph didn't want to do this. He was very hesitant, but an angel commanded him to do it. And I thought, well, what would that sound like? Like if you were listening to the angel actually do that. And I have some tools that I've been trying to find a way to come out and do some stuff with. So I said, well, what if we just had a fly on the wall looking at those conversations? What would it look like? And so I put on my VR headset and I have this puppet app and I'm like, okay, I'm going to pretend to be the angel as I envision them to be. Let's listen to what that would sound like and see what it would be. And so I'm going to share some of that with you now. Some of you have probably already seen this video, but we'll just take a look at some of it. We won't do the whole thing here. All right, here we go. All right, let's... angel commanded it.
Bada bing, hey, Joe, it's me. How's it going? All right, now, Joe, listen. All right, now, I know you're saying a prayer. You're trying to ask for all the good things, for all, the people who have, problems and stuff. And that's great, you're trying to take care of people. But I got to tell you, there's a new kind of work that we got to have for you to do, and you're going to do it, all right? Now, it's like this, you see. We got to get all these righteous spirits from, the spirit place in the premortal existence into righteous Mormon households. So how we gonna do this? You know what? You got one man, one woman, they get together, 9 months later you get one kid. inefficient, all right? We gotta do it a way that it's a way that people can do it. You gotta have one man, one woman, bada bing, bada boom, 9 months later, all right? But in the 9 months, you got that same man, well, another woman, bada bing, bada boom, 9 months later, another time, another woman, bada bing, bada boom. That's how we do it. That's how we get the thing done, you know?
So that's just kind of looking at the concept that the whole point of the revelation is to raise up righteous seed. You can just look at the Doctrine and Covenants revelation and see that it's right there. So the angel at some point had to make that case for him, because that was what Joseph then taught other people. So the whole series, each little bit is an example of taking something that Joseph taught and saying, well, if that was the case, the angel had to teach it to him. What would that have actually sounded like? And, I kind of envision it like a mafia person, specifically because of the story of the angel with the sword. If you don't do it, then you're going to be destroyed with this sword. And we're just like, oh, that's terrible. Why would, Joseph had no choice. He was going to have to do that. Well, regardless of how free agency gets tossed out the window, when you read the text of D&C 132, that's the same proposition being handed to the women. If you don't allow your husband to do this, you're going to be destroyed. Why do we not have the same compassion for the women who are under that we seem to have for Joseph Smith? It's a double standard. And it just reveals the very coercive and threatening nature of this entire proposition. It's crazy. Anyway, so if you would like to call and give us a little bit of your take on what we've discussed today, the number is 210-422-2222. We love to hear from you. In the meantime, let's take another look at our... somebody in the comments called this, they're like, oh, it's the Italian angel Moroni, and then somebody has said, it's the angel Corleone, and I thought that was a great name to be given to this guy. I don't know where he's going to show up next, but let's take a look. Boop.
That chica you saw the other day, Louisa Beeman, right? Well, I'm just, I'm gonna have to come out and say it, all right? You're gonna need to marry her, Joe. Now, I know you're already married, you already got Emma, and, you love her a lot and whatnot, but, truth be told, you better be careful about the coffee that you drink, for some reasons other than that it's a hot drink. But anyway, another thing, Louisa Beeman, she's a good-looking broad, right? Well, we got to work for you to do, you're going to do it. Well, you don't like that? Well, you think that, they got a right to say no or whatever? This is what you do, okay? If they don't like it, they say no, you just tell them, they're going to be destroyed if they don't do it, huh? Some people don't like it when you say no to God's messenger. You just tell them. Whoa, Joseph.
All right. So, again, we see, even in the examples that we've covered in the last two episodes, and this will become even more abundantly clear when we get to the third episode of my response to Brian Hales, that this notion that women are given a choice. And you'll see every time Brian Hales talks about that, he ends up quoting Lucy Walker, who says that the women are offered a choice. This is something that could not be denied to them. And it sounds like a good thing, but when you read her entire quote, you'll see that it's the same sort of choice that a mafia person would give you. You could either accept this proposition, or your spirit and your internal existence is going to be cut off from God. It's the same type of coercive relationship. So, anyway, do you have an opinion on this? Feel free to comment or give a call, 210-422-2222. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, so regarding those Abrahamic tests, Reeb Love says, it is sad to see that these loyalty tests happen today. How many families are torn apart because mom and dad choose the church over their homosexual child, or a child who chooses to leave the church? And I think this is, it's one of those things where we can see, like, Joseph going to Heber C. Kimball and saying, give me your wife. Okay, that's an Abrahamic test. He's having to choose between Joseph or loyalty to his family member. And I think it's very insightful to see that people today in their lives are being given a very similar loyalty test, where they're having to choose between a family member and a loved one or their devotion and submission to the church. And the example of a child who comes out as gay, posing that problem for their family members who have to decide whether or not they're going to follow the instructions of the brethren, to see their child in a way that they are engaged in perversion, as we heard in the recent General Conference, that they are broken and in need of fixing, that there is something inherently opposed to the purposes of God by their existence. You have to either accept that view of your loved one, or you completely embrace and accept your loved one and you discard these men claiming to speak for God. And your loyalty to the church and all of the social standing that goes along with that is tied into that decision. And the church may give lip service to the idea that, you don't have to choose between the church and your loved one. You can still accept and love your loved one. But what is not said is that they place boundaries on the type and extent of that love and what it can be. And you can only show love and acceptance of your family member in ways that are appropriate and approved by the church. And it's them inserting themselves in your individual and personal relationships in a way that we wouldn't give any other institution the power to do so. All right, so let's see. You can call if you'd like to give us some of your thoughts. The phone number is 210-422-2222. Let's take a little bit of a look again at our dear angel. See what he has to say next.
If nobody said that you was gonna be committing adultery. Yeah, okay, so some of these women, maybe they already married to some guys, but it's not a big deal, right? It's not a big deal it's not a big deal for me. It's not a big deal for, the big guy upstairs. So why should it be a big deal for you, huh? You're gonna do what we said, right? Well, okay, this is all right, I understand. Okay, you worried about it. Well, perhaps they're gonna raise some objections. Well, this is what you do, okay? Now, you remember we gave you that revelation, right, about the new and everlasting covenant, right? And we told you that all the old covenants is done away for the new and everlasting covenant, right? So if one of them starts raising up a big fuss or whatnot, right, you just tell them, you say, hey, as soon as you get together with me, that prior covenant, you could just forget about it. Like, forget about it. It wasn't even there. You forget about it.
I just hope that next time Brian Hales uses this particular argument, that with the new covenant, all the old covenants were gone, that somebody sends him a link to this so he can realize that what he's saying is like, you just forget about it, because that's what you do. That's, anything that you can do to excuse the prophet is acceptable, regardless of what it is. Regardless of whether or not it respects the laws of the land, whether or not it respects the pre-existing relationship that Joseph Smith inserted himself into on his claim of authority. It's pretty crazy. All right. Well, we are getting close to an hour and a half, and if we don't have any calls, then we may go ahead and wrap it up. But I love listening to the Italian Angel so much, we're going to listen to another section of him. It's weird because there's a little bit of vocal processing done on the voice, so I don't even hear it as my own, and so it makes it more entertaining in that regard. All right, here we go.
All right, Joe, now I know... we originally told you got to take these other women, you got to marry them and whatnot, bada bing, bada boom, our kids. But, it can't be like this, Joe. I mean, you keep wanting just to go after these old widows, like you're going to provide for them or whatever. That's all nice, yeah, you're a really good guy, whatever. We already know that. But, the purpose of this commandment is not to take care of the old widows. It's because we got to get these spirits onto the earth in righteous Mormon homes, okay? So these widows aren't pumping out any more babies, Joe. I'm just going to tell you, all right? They's done. They got stuff. They got to be, tending the farm and doing all that crap. That's not conducive to fertility, all right? So I need you to go after the young ones, all right? We need some young ones. Now, you can get some of the old ladies because the old ladies is trusted by the young ones, all right? So the old ladies, maybe they'll help smooth the way a little bit, so when you introduce it to some lady, the old ladies be like, hey, it's okay, that's all right. So
that example of having the old ladies to smooth the way for the young ladies is one that we saw in Joseph's proposal to Nancy Rigdon. You had Miranda Hyde be there to kind of smooth it over for him, and there's other examples even that we saw in the examples today where I think it was Rachel Ivins or one of the other ones talked about their parents introducing it to them first. And it sounds like, would Joseph really be that scheming and everything? But you have to understand that people who prey upon young, vulnerable victims do so in a complex web of psychosocial dynamics. And we call it now, we've identified it as grooming behavior when we see abusers do it. And that's exactly what that is. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Hello, Jonathan. How are you today?
I'm doing good.
Good, good. Hey, I really have appreciated your work over the years. You put a lot of time and effort into that, and hope it helps a lot of people.
Thank you.
In wherever they are in their journey. So I wanted to say I'm not LDS or have not been, and anything I say, I'd certainly always want to be loving towards those. If an LDS person happens to be listening to your show, and so don't want to come across in a negative fashion. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, I listened to your show yesterday, and I think I caught sort of the midsection of it. Wasn't able to see the whole thing, but I believe it was the validity of the Nauvoo Expositor. Is that right?
That was, yeah. It's talking about one particular facet of it. Yes. Right.
Yeah. Well, I've done a pretty excessive amount of study. My girlfriend happens to be LDS, and so when I really start to study things, I sink my teeth into it. So I've read a lot of the books and all, and I think that one thing people can keep in mind when you're trying to ascertain whether you have two sides of a story and you're trying to ascertain which side is really true, and uncovering all of that, and certainly the amount of hits that you get on particular scenarios, specific with Joseph's his polygamy. I think you also have to look at the reaction that comes from those who are involved within the religious movement. And one of the ones that I think is quite interesting. Sorry, I was getting somebody on the other line there. One of the more interesting ones is the testimony of Martha Brotherton. Did I pronounce her name correctly?
Yeah, Martha Brotherton.
And she is approached by Joseph and specifically Brigham Young, and is I'm sorry, I was trying to collect my thoughts here. And I'm sure you've read it, but if people haven't, you can find it at chroniclingamerica.loc.gov, and it's called The Radical. And it's a really revealing look as to what was going on in the arm bending, if you will, between Brigham Young and herself. And what's also interesting is at that time she was from England, and after that time she had and her family had published information, was handing out information apparently in Nauvoo, and so they were trying to muzzle the what was taking place there. And then in the Millennial Star, I believe it was it John Taylor who ran the Millennial Star in Britain?
It may have been. I think Pratt did for a period of time, but I don't recall the exact time.
Yeah. Anyhow, when you look at it, really gives a validity when you read that. It's the Millennial Star, and it's speaking of apostasy. If I can read just a small excerpt of it, I think it sheds light onto this. And it says, the spirit of apostasy has now been quite prevalent of late, principally among those who have immigrated from England to America. They are first seized with a murmuring and fault-finding spirit towards those who have suffered perils and privations by sea and land, for them and for the cause of truth. They seek to injure by all manner of evil speaking and railing accusation. Next, they find fault with their sea voyage and the provisions and sea tours as being either too scarce or not suited to their appetite. Next, they find fault with the country. So he's listing all these things they find fault with. And then lastly, and I'm skipping down to the next paragraph, among the most conspicuous of these apostates, we would notice a young female who immigrated from Manchester to September last, and who, after conducting herself in a manner unworthy the character of one professing godliness, at length convinced the plea of gaining friendship and extraordinary notoriety with the world, or rather with the enemies of truth, by striking a blow at the character of some of its worthiest champions. She well knew that this would be received as a sweet morsel by her old friends, the Methodists, and other enemies of the saints. She accordingly selected President Joseph Smith and Elder B. Young for her victims, and wrote to England that these men had been trying to seduce her by making her believe that God had given a revelation that men might have two wives. So I'm just going to stop there, but this is really a direct knee-jerk reaction to something that really, I believe, happened in space and time. And it gives a lot more validity to her claims. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Yeah. And so I think that whenever anybody is doing their research into this, you really have to look at all sides of the story. And as you have pointed out so many times in the past, is that when you're only given one set of narratives, a narrative, you can't really make an educated assessment as to what truth really is. You don't even have a fighting chance. And so I just thought I'd call in and just give a little excerpt of something.
Well, it's actually very...
Go ahead. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is that it's actually very pertinent to the subject at hand, because, for people who are not familiar with the Martha Brotherton story, her family immigrated to Nauvoo. And this is, remember, they lived and were happy in their life in England. I can't say they were happy in their life, but they lived in England. They accepted the proselytizing efforts of the missionaries and decided to uproot their entire existence and come to Nauvoo. That's a huge sacrifice, and it places them in a very vulnerable position. And they did so under the notion that the church and the gospel was represented to them in one way. And then when they get to Nauvoo, suddenly they're being introduced to a completely foreign concept to them. And that is that Martha Brotherton, is a young woman invited to conference with President Smith, is then met by Brigham Young and Joseph Smith and taught this idea that there can be multiple wives, and she rejects it. And in the course of that, we hear from her accounting of this story that Joseph Smith even said, "Take Brother Brigham on. If you don't like him later, I'll take you on myself." Like, it's just like this, transactional thing. And that she felt like she had been locked in the room and compelled to respond. And, I think there's at one point someone said, "Well, at least give me a kiss," or something like that. There's all of this, what would be seen as sensational details of this interaction. And if you watch the lengthy treatment of the Nancy Rigdon happiness letter, it's happening around the same time, and those rumors of the Martha Brotherton affair are still in the air. But what you have in the response, as you're correctly pointing out, is that the leaders of the church will not hesitate to completely destroy the character and reputation of a woman who reveals their behavior to the public. And that was Martha Brotherton's sin. If she had remained quiet about it, then probably there would have been no retaliation. But because she blabbed, because she revealed the perfidy and the deception of the leaders, then we have to paint her and people who might support her as dissidents, as people who are critical. And then you'll notice when they start talking about her specifically, they start saying that she is unvirtuous. And we hear other people use the term whore when they describe people who were simply being honest about Joseph Smith's failed proposals to them. Now, the letter that we are reading, this response that we're reading in these three parts from Brian Hales, is in response to a prior article I made called Indecent Proposals. And that was where we cover the Martha Brotherton story and other stories such as Nancy Rigdon. I haven't done it in podcast form, but it was it's there in the text form, and you can see her whole story and how her name was dragged through the mud, and it absolutely supports the idea that Joseph and the apostles and the leadership of the church retaliated against anyone who came forward and made it public. And that is the key difference that we'll explore in part 3 of the response, which is you have to look at the claim that was actually made by John C. Bennett as to what the leaders were doing, and that he was retaliating against people who came public about their responses. So it's very disingenuous when defenders of Joseph like Brian Hales say, well, Joseph, his preferred response was to just let it rest. Well, his preferred response by the women was for them to not blab. But when they did blab, then their names got dragged through the mud. But Brian Hales smooths that over by saying that Joseph preferred to correct any accusations that he feel were falsely made. And so that is just a nice way of saying retaliate. Because when you look at what that correction entailed, it entailed allowing others to drag her name through the mud. And when you think about it, let's suppose that Joseph Smith did actually love these women and pursued them and respected them. If he had made these proposals to them and they refused him, then if they go out and they said, Joseph Smith proposed to me and I said no, his response as a gentleman should be, I did. I find her to be a highly virtuous woman, greatly desirable. I wanted her to be my wife. She said no, and I respect her for that, and I only wish her the best. Like, that's how you treat someone who you love and respect enough to propose to. But instead, he allowed everybody around him to call them whores, to drag them name through the mud, and to essentially ruin their reputation and place pressure on their family unless they conform, to the extent that they're now publishing it on the other side of the world, as you point out, with the Millennial Star. So it's great to hear that as an outsider studying these things, because I'm sure, like many people who have girlfriends or boyfriends in the church, you may be invited to listen to lessons or to participate. And so if you study to say, well, I want to know what I'm getting into, you can pick up on these elements of really nefarious coercion that happen that you just like, wait a second, let's step back and look at that. But then getting somebody who is deep in the indoctrination to realize that and to see that it's a problem is a whole other challenge in and of itself. So I can only wish you the best in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge, I think, for just about anybody. And you can see this even within culture and society. Everybody has a team that they're a part of, right?
Yeah.
A quote team. You can,
us and them.
Whatever that team is, right?
Yeah.
And you're right. It's always us versus them. And it's so difficult for we as humans to take a step back and try to be as objective as possible and say, is this really right? This viewpoint that I have on this particular subject matter, maybe there's something else that I'm missing here. And I would say that a vast majority of us are very biased and really don't really want to know truth. And I think particularly when it comes to a religious experience where your eternal life is potentially at stake, you're going to double, triple, quadruple down when it just doesn't make sense, even in other areas of one's own life. Yeah. And I think that's where where it's so powerful, where people will not apply the same scrutiny to their own religious system as they do to other religious systems and or within the secular realm as well. And I would also think, and maybe I don't know whether this is your experience or not, but I think it must just take so many bits of information along the way to be able to start to sway your mind and open yourself up, to calm yourself down to where it's like, okay, there's not just a spark here. This is a bonfire. It's all over the place. But if you're not given the information or given it in context, you really are not. You're held in this captive prison of being able to really figure out what's right and wrong and what's true. Yeah. And so I would just suggest that if there are any LDS people, listening to you on this podcast, to don't be afraid, just allow yourself, give yourself permission as I heard Grant Palmer say one time, just give yourself permission to look, because some of the good guys are the bad guys, and the bad guys are the good guys.
And it's funny because a lot of that, some people have described it like a prison of belief, where you're not only are you told which pieces of information or sources of information are safe and which are dangerous, you're also warned about the negative consequences of losing your belief or losing your faith. And it's just helpful to step back and realize that, wait a second, all of those negative consequences that are preventing me from having that open state of mind out of fear of being deceived, fear of loss of my eternal family, all these things, all those negative consequences were told to me by the very people who benefit from me never actually challenging what they say to see if it's true or not, or legitimate or authoritative. And the corollary to that is, if I do challenge it and learn that their statements and the foundation of their authority is false, then that means that all of their warning negative, messages are also not worthy of me being afraid of, because they're just simply self-reinforcing negative lies to get me to stay in a false system of belief. And we're easy to see that, as you mentioned, in other groups, in Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses, but we're not able to see that as much in our own. So I appreciate your outsider perspective on that.
And I would add to what you're saying there. I think that if you are met with fear about any particular subject matter, it might throw at least a caution flag to you. Why is it that you're being so fearful about this particular subject matter? You can even see it within media, within our secular realm. People control other people through fear. It's very, very powerful. And so if you're feeling really fearful about looking up some information, it's probably because somebody doesn't want you to look it up, because you might find out the truth about that particular matter at hand, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Johnson, I won't take up more of your time. Thank you so much.
I love your observations. Yeah, excellent. All right, thanks for the call.
You bet. Bye-bye.
All right. Phone lines are open again. We're at 1 hour and 42 minutes. I don't want to go beyond 2 hours, but in the meantime, while we wait for our next call, we got to see what our good angel friend has to say. Let's take it away. Let's see. Oh, we got our other call. Hold up. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Good.
What's on your mind?
Good. I just wanted to call in. I love your show. Been a viewer for well over a year, and just found a lot of your topics you address are things that others aren't either addressing, or, I grew up in the church 30 years and never even heard of some of these things. And it was just great to kind of, research this and find out that your research was solid and it wasn't just some kind of tangent or made up. And you could actually bring this to people and say, look, fact check it if you want. It's solid. And I just really want to thank you for that.
Oh, I appreciate it. That's one of the things that I think when I was doing my own journey, I was very cautious about where I would get information from, and I wanted to be able to feel confident about information. And so when I started writing my own stuff, I wanted to make sure that I was citing sources that could be trusted, something you could go as close to source documents as possible. And just because I'm kind of like writing to myself and my family members, like if they ever followed my breadcrumbs, that they would be able to have the same confidence. So I'm glad that you found that useful.
Yeah, no, definitely. Just touching on the topic here, just kind of an interesting point with some of the women who said no to Joseph. One in particular, Lucy Walker. And just what's really funny, and I think what really aided my, journey out of everything was that apologetics. I was 30 years in the church, a returned missionary, served the whole 2 years, Sunday school teacher for 10. And when you have questions, a lot of times they're met with, oh, maybe this is just your sin talking, or is there something else going on in your life? Or,
Yeah.
sometimes people will, say, well, check out Fair Mormon or something similar to that. And so you go to the apologetics. And of course, so much of it is just terrible and just apologizing away horrible behavior. And it really aids, and I know speaking for others too, it really aids us in our journey out. Because when these are the so-called big guns, the people who studied and given their life to, defending the church, and you just see how garbage the apologetics are, it really helps in aiding leaving the church, right? Based on just going, I don't want to support this. I don't want to be a cog in the machine that supports this. Even just saying, oh, well, it was a long time ago and it was okay for back then, so we just have to kind of accept it. That's even in some ways more disgusting. But just looking at Lucy Walker in particular, and she was one that, Joseph gave her basically the 24-hour proposition after, of course, hounding her for months to become, part of the spiritual wifery that was going on. And of course, you read her her diary, and he gives her the proposition. She, of course, is disgusted by it and can't believe, that this is happening. And you even read some of it. Some of it's sad, like why was I singled out, right? Why should I be chosen from among thy daughters? Just this horrible place you got to be in, where you realize, I'm essentially in a cult compound. I have this older man who is revered by thousands, including my family, and he wants me to be one of his wives. And of course, back in the 19th century, just like today, it would be hard hitting, but even back then, I'm kind of assuming, based on things you read, that it would be twice as hard hitting. And then for this poor woman to be hounded and put in that position. And then, of course, reading the Fair Mormon and then her diary, Joe Smith gives her, okay, by the morning you should feel better, and you read it, and of course she wakes up and the sun kind of comes through the windows, and it almost seems kind of like a first vision account in some ways with the light hitting her. And then Joseph, and then this is the creepiest part, she comes down the stairs and there's Joseph outside the door waiting for her, saying, I knew you'd see it my way. I prayed too, right? And then she kind of, says, oh, I was filled with joy and happiness. Of course, always leaving out the kind of part that, this man had hounded her for months. And he went to her brother or father, I can't remember which one, and said, as they're riding along on their horses, telling him all about this, at kind of, in a Fair Mormon sort of saying, like, look, wasn't he really a good guy? He's even asking permission for to take her hand. And look, wasn't this great that, in the end, she, basically what they're saying is, threw away her morals and just was obedient, because when has that ever gone wrong, right? Yeah. And just the last line that just, this is the only case of a deadline being given, and it only came because Joseph saw how unhappy Lucy was as she hesitated with her decision over periods of months. Just this, and that's apologetic. That's Fair Mormon right there, quoting directly from them. So it's just this. It's almost this. I don't know. I'm sure some are very sincere and believe this, but I think it's just this.
And you have to, it's also like there's the one element that's like invisibly behind all of this is that her mother died. Her father Joseph sent her father away on a mission, and now she's living in Joseph's home doing housework as a maid / foster daughter. And so that's the context in which this proposal is made, in which this deadline is made. Losing sight of, just that, I don't know how in depth into that background Fair Mormon goes, but you're absolutely right. It's just so coercive, and him giving her a deadline does not help things.
But just and 100% agree, and a great point, right? She was, follow the money. She was reliant upon these people. It would be hard just to say, no, go away, and then what's going to happen now, right? And definitely not blaming her. I mean, she was just a victim, really. And, just reading this last line of how it's like, wasn't Joseph such a good person? I mean, he saw how she was struggling with this.
Oh,
And
he helped her.
the 24-hour ultimatum, I mean, that was just merciful and graceful on the part of Brother Joseph. Like, it's just insane, right? And of course, as you pointed out before, if just looking at myself, if I would have read this about L. Ron Hubbard, I would have been like, oh, well, there you go. There's the proof. This guy's disgusting, right? I mean, how could anyone believe that, church? I'm so glad we don't have those skeletons in our closet, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, of course, when you do read it, I mean, you can do one or two things. You could say, well, go into apologetics mode and go, well, Joseph did the right thing. He was a man of his times or whatever. I mean, God spoke to him. What would you do? Or you can look at it and go, am I going to be part of this? Am I going to apologize away, essentially a sex predator?
Yeah.
And like, there's a lot of good Mormons out there. You always hear, good Mormons and my parents, still in it and great people. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's like you are supporting and excusing a sex predator based on solid evidence, based on church history. It's not just crazy Joe the Bishop spouting things from the pulpit. I mean, this is,
based on the accounts of the very people involved themselves who are testifying to these things as though they're supporting the prophet. They're telling you what happened, thinking that they're defending Joseph, because in the context of history, where in the Temple Lot case, they had to make the case that Joseph did practice polygamy by showing the reality of the accounts of the witnesses. And so they don't realize that what they're describing in accounting these histories is what we now in the modern time recognize as the actions and arguments of a religious sexual predator. They didn't have the vocabulary back then to realize that that's what it was, but that is what it is. And you define them by them using these mechanisms in order to compel people to enter into these illicit, unorthodox, imbalanced relationships.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we're kind of lucky in a way that we today can see breakoffs from the Mormon Church that still practice polygamy. Warren Jeffs being a prime example, and how when he was caught sitting in court and just that glazed over look on his face, and how many Mormons were like, oh, how disgusting, could you imagine, blah blah blah. And I'm like, that would have been the early church. That would have been Joseph Smith if there was law and order like we have today. I mean, Joseph Smith, if he was to come back, which church do you think he would more identify with? The LDS version of Mormonism, or the FLDS, where people are walking around in pioneer dresses living on a compound? You know what I mean? Like,
That's a presentism.
Really, my money's on them.
You're falling into a presentism. God's revelations are colored by the needs and the circumstances of the people, and the circumstances now are different from the circumstances in 1842. And it's because we got to get the righteous spirits into the good Mormon homes. I don't know.
No, I mean 100%. And when you bring it up today, like even with my mother, I said, well, there's still practice beyond the grave, plural marriage. I mean, there's people like I live out here on the east coast of Canada, right? And believe it or not, this is what was one of the first early Mormon establishments in Canada. And so the roots kind of go back here kind of deep, because they had an early missionary presence. Now it's just, it's kind of sad in a way. Sometimes you go back for church because you find out someone's going to get a blessing. You're like, okay, whatever, right? I still have family in the church. I'll go back. And it's literally, I think when the internet came out, it just chopped membership, down to a third of what it was, because all of a sudden now you couldn't hide it. It wasn't in boring books, tucked away. I mean, it was right there, clear and concise. And the church authorities just didn't have good answers. And then Fair Mormon, of course, comes out, and most people who read that again will see just the excusing of terrible behavior. And it's a good thing, but it's also a little sad sometimes when you just see how it's just gone down to nothing. It's just some old people basically clinging to hope and hoping one day that the young people will see the light as they get older. And it's sad in the sense of seeing the desperation on some good people's face, right? And that's all I mean. Not sad in seeing this being exposed to light. Not saying that.
And I think you probably have some of my own thoughts when I go and I see something like that, which is that there was a lot of fun, beautiful things about being raised in the church that I really, really enjoyed and liked. And and so if it had been true, those things would have been beautiful. But it comes along with so many harmful, damaging, toxic, dangerous ideas that you just can't sacrifice one for the other. And there are communities that can bring some of those positive things that you don't have to accept, false prophetic authority along with in order to have the positive aspects. It's just, there is an element of nostalgia when I think back on that. And even when I go and visit churches today of why can't we have the good parts without the bad parts?
Yeah, no, definitely 100% agree. I mean, that would have been a nice thing, but I guess it would have been too easy, according to some Mormon theology. It would have been too easy, and everyone would have joined. And then where's the sacrifice? And then, of course, Brigham Young saying religion can't demand the hardest of its members, something like that.
Yeah, doesn't have the power to save.
There's always a way to just apologize it all away, right? And at some point, I think you just got to say, okay, enough is enough. And let's say Mormonism turns out to be 100% true, and I'm standing before the pearly gates, and it's, hey, it was true. If God is merciful and kind and just and all this stuff, right? I mean, is he really he's going to condemn somebody who studied and read and had historical facts and was bringing these questions up and receiving, terrible replies? Really, you're just going to condemn somebody for rejecting that, right? For not superseding their morals for obedience, which really is, and I don't think a lot of people realize that when you do study Mormonism, all the leaders, and this is a big statement, it's a broad brushing statement, but Mormonism at the heart of it is not moral. It's not moral. Morals are always being superseded, changed. They'll claim moral, but at the heart of it is obedience. 100% obedience. That will supersede morals all the time, because morals can be corrupted, morals can be man-made, morals can be influenced by the world. But whereas obedience and following it, no matter how ridiculous it is or how much it undermines your morals, that's what the LDS Church really cares about when it comes down to paying tithing, to teaching a Sunday school lesson. Are you going to veer off, throw in some little tangents that make people think, no, you're going to stick.
Okay. It looks like we lost our caller, but I 100% agree with you if you're able to hear me now. The way I look at it is very much similar to what you said, which is that there is only one moral principle in Mormonism, and that is obedience. Everything else is subordinate to that, because at any point, if your obedience is in contradiction with what the leaders standing in their offices as prophets of God tell you to do, then you are told that you are the one with the problem, and you have to bend your mind and subvert your conscience to conform with the leaders. And you can just look back over the landscape of church history, over the important social issues around race, around LGBT individuals, around blood atonement, around all these different things. And at the time, if you were a subordinate to a leader and you were contradicting what they were proclaiming as the word of God, you would have been the one with the problem. Even if the church later admits that the prophets got it wrong, or that they were only speaking as men at the time, if you were alive at the time, the expectation on you as a member was obedience. And that's the only moral principle. All right. Well, it was interesting that he was talking about Lucy Walker and, these kids that Joseph Smith took into his home, because the angel had something to say about that. I think that might be the next one. Let's take a listen.
Oh, hey, Joe. Hey, I'm just checking up on you. Gonna see how things have been going. Last time we told me, you said that
Oh, no, okay. This one is about Helen Mar Kimball. So let's see what we have to...
Plan for Helen Ma Kimball, that 14-year-old girl. What is she? What? She's almost 15. She's essentially 15, right? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. You had a plan. Okay, what is it? So you told her about the thing, yeah? You had her dad tell her. Okay, that's good. She trusts her dad. Maybe she believe it better from him, knowing that he's okay with it, right? That makes sense. All right. She said yes, of course. I mean, hey, you're the prophet, right? She said no. Well, she said no. Well, Joe, that's not gonna do. That's not working for me. It's not working for you. It's not working for the guy upstairs. What are we gonna do, Joe? Oh, okay. Okay, Joe. This is what you do, all right? You tell her that, if she does the thing, if she gets sealed to use, well, then her entire family gonna be saved in heaven. It's gonna work, Joe. You give it a try. Joe...
That's one of the things that whole story about Helen Mar Kimball is more offensive because of the notion that he had to promise her family salvation in heaven. Okay, so this is going to be the last one. I'm pretty sure this is the one about the foster children. Then we will go ahead and close it out for today. We lost that last caller in the middle of it. The call dropped for some reason. I apologize. I'm sorry about that. It was a really good stream of thoughts that you were conveying. But let's close it out with this one, and then we will go from there.
I don't know how to do it. I'm just gonna have to come out and tell you. You know those girls you took into your house, Joe? The dad was having some hard times or whatever. You took them into your house, sent the dad away to recuperate and whatnot. Well, those girls, they're essentially your foster kids, right? You walk them around, they call you dad, you call them, daughter, whatever. All right, you're a good guy. You're taking care of their finances or whatever. Well, the word came down from above. You're gonna have to marry these girls, Joe. Now, I know. They're your foster daughters or whatever. People might not like it. Well, that's why we're going to keep it on the down low, Joe. Like, they're not even going to know that each of them is married to you secretly. So you take each one of them, you kind of take them off to the side, you teach them the principle, you make them swear not to betray you, and you just let that principle fester a little bit. They're going to come around, Joe. I mean, what else are they going to do? I mean, you're housing and feeding them, right?
And that explains kind of how my own relationship with Joseph Smith went. I learned about the principle. I learned about how he conducted his affairs. I learned about the problems with the Book of Abraham, the Book of Mormon, polygamy, and I let that fester. And when you think about it, and you read the arguments and excuses from apologetics like Fair Mormon, and when they say apologetics, they're not saying that these people are apologizing, they're acknowledging error and issuing an apology. No, what they're doing is they're providing rationales and explanations so that you will no longer have a problem with what you're learning or reading. You'll increase your understanding or come up with some way to be okay with what Joseph Smith did. That once you see that and you realize if you're going to accept those as the rationale for excusing what you see as inherently abusive, false, deceptive practices, then that's a reality, a religion, a prophet that you want nothing to do with, because allowing those types of exceptions would not allow somebody under the spell of L. Ron Hubbard to escape his influence. It wouldn't allow anybody under the spell of David Koresh to escape those influences. And so if those excuses and rationales can't empower somebody in those deceptive situations to escape, then we have no business using them in our own rationale for Joseph Smith. So with that being said, we will close it out for today. This has been Talk on Things and Stuff, and tomorrow we'll take a look at part 3 of our examination of the Brian Hales rationale on Joseph Smith. So until next time, take care.